Richard's world was made of glass skyscrapers and billion-dollar businesses. But one autumn afternoon in Boston, it was his inner world that came crashing down when his 6-year-old son, Leo, disappeared amid the luxury boutiques of Newbury Street. In a panic, he discovered that all his power on Wall Street was worthless on that brick sidewalk. The authorities were called, but time was running out, and despair was utter. The only hope came from the most unlikely source: Sammy, a 5-year-old boy in a faded Red Sox cap, whose only possession in the world was half a cracked cracker. With a single gesture, the boy not only anchored him in his worst nightmare, but began a journey that would redefine what Richard understood about legacy, power, and family. But before we find out how a broken cookie could rebuild a man, and how this search for a lost son led to the creation of Boston's most extraordinary family, we want to know, which city are you watching from? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and let's explore this exciting story together. The autumn air in Boston had that crisp, invigorating touch that promised the end of summer, painting the leaves along Newbury Street with hues of gold and crimson. For Richard, that afternoon was a rare oasis of calm in a desert of corporate obligations. A man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dictating the pace of multi-million-dollar negotiations, he walked at a deliberately slow pace, his 6-year-old son, Leo, holding his hand firmly in his. The small hand was an anchor that grounded him in the present, in what truly mattered, far from the projection spreadsheets and investor calls that consumed his existence. They had no plan, and that, for Richard, was the greatest freedom. They simply strolled, gazing at the windows of upscale boutiques, the reflections of brownstone buildings in the windows, and the steady stream of stylish people, tourists and students, that made up the human tapestry of that iconic street. With every laugh Leo gave, pointing at a dog in a funny sweater or the decorations in a candy store, Richard felt a knot in his chest loosen, a knot he hadn't even known was there, tightened by the relentless pressure to succeed. They stopped in front of an art gallery, where a twisted metal sculpture gleamed in the afternoon sun. Leo, with the boundless curiosity of childhood, pressed his face against the glass, leaving a small breath mark. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that rarely appeared in his work environment. He knelt beside his son, the expensive fabric of his suit brushing against the brick sidewalk, and tried to explain what the artist might have meant by the work. The conversation was simple, full of childish wise and patient answers. In that moment, he wasn't the CEO of Sterling Corp, a respected and feared figure in the financial world. He was just Dad. The promise he'd made to his wife, Catherine, to disconnect for an entire afternoon seemed not only possible, but necessary. He promised himself, crouched beside his son, that he would make this a priority, that he wouldn't allow ambition to steal the essence of his life. Little did he know that the universe, with its cruel irony, was about to put that promise to the test in the most brutal way imaginable, transforming that golden afternoon into the stage for his greatest nightmare. The insistent buzzing of the cell phone in his pocket was the first crack in the dome of peace he had built. Instinct, honed by years of relentless discipline, made him reach for his pocket immediately. He saw his COO's name on the screen and hesitated for a second. The promise to Catherine echoed in his mind, but habit, that gravitational force of adulthood, won out. "1 minute, champ," he said to Leo, ruffling his hair. He took 2 steps away, turning toward the street noise for some privacy. The conversation was what it always was: a problem, an urgent decision, numbers that didn't add up, a crisis in an Asian subsidiary that demanded his immediate attention. His voice changed, the fatherly tone giving way to the sharp, efficient timbre of an executive. His brain, with frightening speed, traded metal sculptures for market projections, his son's hand for the need for damage control. He gestured, his focus completely consumed by the problem thousands of miles away, oblivious to the small world that existed just behind him. While Richard was immersed in his corporate world, Leo encountered a new wonder. A street artist further down the sidewalk was beginning to create giant balloon animals, a pink poodle, a monkey clinging to a lamppost. For a 6-year-old boy, it was pure magic. He let go of the hem of his father's coat, which he didn't even feel, and took a few hesitant steps, then a few more, drawn like an insect to the light. He joined a small circle of other children and adults watching the spectacle, their eyes wide with wonder at every twist and squeak of the colored latex. He was only 10 meters away, a small detour, an innocent distraction. To him, his father was still there, a constant and assured presence, only momentarily occupied. He had no concept of the danger, of how quickly the world could disintegrate. He was safe in his bubble of wonder, completely unaware that to his father he was about to disappear from the face of the earth. "Fix it. I don't care how," Richard said into the phone, the final sentence ending the conversation and, unbeknownst to him, his life as he knew it. He hung up, the relief of having put out yet another fire mingling with the guilt of having broken his promise. He turned, an apology already forming on his lips, ready to make it up to Leo with whatever he wanted. But the space beside him was empty. The smile on his face froze, transforming into a mask of confusion. He glanced at the gallery window, expecting to see Leo's reflection, but saw only his own. A man in an expensive suit, looking suddenly pale and out of place. His first thought was rational, calm. He must have gone into the gallery. Or maybe he's hiding behind that potted plant, one of his pranks. "Leo," he called, his voice still controlled, almost casual. The sound was swallowed by the murmur of the street. He took a few steps, looking around, his heart still beating normally, his mind still refusing to accept what his eyes couldn't see. The first pinprick of panic pierced the superficial calm. He entered the art gallery, the quiet, air-conditioned space a stark contrast to the chaos beginning to blossom in his chest. "Leo," he called again, louder this time. The receptionist looked at him disapprovingly. He scanned the space, his eyes flickering over the paintings and sculptures, searching for a small figure with blonde hair and a red jacket. Nothing. He returned to the street, his breath growing shallow. He looked up and down the sidewalk. The crowd, once a picturesque scene, now resembled a dense, menacing forest, filled with anonymous faces that could have swallowed his son. Every child wearing a red garment that passed by made his heart leap violently, followed by an equally brutal drop of disappointment. Logic was dissolving, replaced by a primal, visceral fear he had never known. The image of Leo's frightened face, alone and crying, began to flash through his mind, a form of self-inflicted torture. Control, the pillar upon which Richard had built his entire identity, began to crumble. The man who had made billion-dollar decisions with glacial calm could now barely think straight. He began pacing in circles, his hands running through his hair, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the chilly air. He picked up his cell phone, his fingers shaking so badly he entered the wrong password twice. Call Catherine. What would he say? How could he possibly say the words, "I lost our son"? Shame was a nauseating wave, as strong as the fear. It was because of one damned phone call. A 1-minute decision that could cost a lifetime of happiness. That deal in Asia, which had seemed like the most important thing in the world 5 minutes ago, was now a bad joke, a meaningless smokescreen before the abyss yawning at his feet. He felt like the most incompetent and failed man on the planet. He began to run, without direction, without a plan, driven only by the adrenaline of terror. He bumped into people, mumbling automatic apologies, unable to even see their faces. His suit, tailored to project power and confidence, was now a woolen prison, too tight and too hot. He ran toward the corner, his heart hammering against his ribs as if it wanted to escape. He looked at the pedestrian crossing, at the sea of cars, and a new layer of horror enveloped him. What if he had crossed the street? The image of his small son, defenseless against the Boston traffic, was so unbearable that he had to lean against a lamppost, gasping for breath. Every face in the crowd was a potential threat. Every passing van a possible kidnapping vehicle. His mind, normally an instrument of sharp logic, had become a torture chamber, projecting the worst-case scenarios in an endless, cruel loop. The feeling of helplessness was absolute. In his world, problems were solved, with a phone call, with an order, with a bank transfer. But there, on that brick sidewalk, his wealth and status were useless. He was just a terrified father, stripped of all his titles and power. He finally spotted a police officer across the street, talking to a shopkeeper. The sight of the blue uniform gave him a glimmer of hope. He waited for the light to change, crossing the street almost in a trance. "My son," he told the officer, his voice hoarse and shaky, barely able to form the words. "He's gone. 6 years old, red jacket." The officer, an older man with a tired face, picked up his radio. The officer's professional calm was somehow maddening to Richard. He wanted the world to stop, for sirens to blare, for everyone to feel the apocalyptic urgency of his loss. But for the officer, it was just another call, another procedure. "We have a possible code Adam on Newbury," the officer said into the radio, his voice monotone. Code Adam, the technical term for a missing child. Hearing that made it all real and official. It was a nightmare. The police officer asked him questions: when he last saw him, what he was wearing, if he had a photo. Richard, with trembling hands, showed the photo he had taken that same afternoon. Leo smiling, his mouth smeared with hot chocolate, in front of the candy store. Seeing that happy smile from that life that existed less than an hour ago was like being punched in the gut. The police officer radioed the description, and Richard's voice, describing his own son as a missing person, broke mid-sentence. The officer advised him to stay close, not to stray. But standing still was torture. Every second was an eternity of agony. He leaned against the brick wall of a building, his legs shaking. The crowd continued to flow by, indifferent. He was in a bubble of suffering, invisible in his pain. He closed his eyes, trying to pray, something he hadn't done since he was a child. But there were no words, just a silent, desperate cry in her soul. Please, no. Please, bring him back. Guilt was a poison spreading through his veins. Every detail of that afternoon haunted him. Why hadn't he insisted Leo stay by his side? Why hadn't he ignored that damned call? He'd traded his son's safety for a business problem that, in the grand scheme of things, meant absolutely nothing. He had failed in his most fundamental role, that of protector. The image of Catherine's face when she discovered his negligence terrified him almost as much as the loss of Leo. It would be the end of everything, not just his happiness, but his marriage, his family, his very identity. He saw himself as a strong man, a provider, a pillar. But in truth, he was a fool who had lost his most precious treasure in a moment of selfish distraction. He hated himself with an intensity he never thought possible. Time dragged on, distorted and cruel. The sounds of the city, horns, distant sirens, music leaking from a store, all seemed to mock him. He began to feel a deep contempt for this place, for the superficial wealth, for the people passing by with their shopping bags, preoccupied with trivialities while their world lay in ruins. For the first time, he saw the fragility of his perfectly constructed life. Security was an illusion. Happiness could be stolen in the blink of an eye. His status, his power, his bank account were useless against raw pain and loss. He stood at the top of a social pyramid that in that moment revealed itself to be made of sand. He was just a man, stripped of everything except the terrified love for his son. And that didn't seem to be enough to find him. He began to hyperventilate. The air felt thick and heavy, impossible to breathe. His vision began to blur at the edges, and the street noise turned into a low, oppressive buzzing in his ears. He crouched on the sidewalk, resting his head on his knees, trying to fight the wave of panic that threatened to drown him. He was at rock bottom, a place of absolute darkness where hope could not penetrate. In his mind, he was already living the future. The fruitless searches, the news on TV, a lifetime of grief and what-ifs. The pain was so overwhelming it became physical, a crushing pressure in his chest, as if his heart were being crushed. The man who never lost, who always had a plan B, was completely and irrevocably lost. His arrogance, his self-confidence, everything had been turned to dust. It was at that moment, the lowest point of his existence, that he felt it. A touch. It wasn't an accidental brush from a hurried pedestrian. It was a light, deliberate and hesitant tap on his shoulder. He barely registered it, his mind still a whirlwind of terror. But the touch lingered, a small tap. Slowly, as if moving underwater, Richard lifted his head. His eyes, red and swollen, took a while to focus. He expected to see the police officer, perhaps a curious onlooker offering useless sympathy. But what he saw took his breath away. Standing before him was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old. He was small and thin, with a soot-smeared face and light brown hair that fell into his eyes. He wore a faded Red Sox cap, a jacket too thin for the approaching cold, and worn sneakers. But it wasn't his poverty that shocked Richard. It was his eyes. They were large, incredibly clear and calm, and they looked at him not with pity, but with a strange, deep understanding, as if he saw straight into Richard's wounded soul. The boy said nothing. He simply stood there, his small hand still resting on the expensive fabric of Richard's suit, a stark contrast between two worlds that rarely met. The noise of the street seemed to recede, and Richard's focus narrowed on that small figure. There was a stillness about the boy that was disconcerting. While Richard was disintegrating inside, a chaos of guilt and panic, that boy exuded a solid presence, a calm that belied his age or circumstance. He didn't seem intimidated by Richard's appearance, nor by the opulence around him. He simply saw a man in pain, and in an act of pure, instinctive humanity, he reached out. That touch, the touch of a dirty hand on a designer suit, was the first thing in minutes that managed to pierce Richard's bubble of terror. It was an unexpected gesture of connection in a moment of absolute isolation, a small spark of light in the darkness that consumed him. The boy's voice, when it finally came, was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the background noise of Richard's mind like a crystal bell. "Mister?" he said, his head tilted to the side, a Boston accent clear in his single word. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, direct, but charged with a genuine sincerity Richard hadn't seen in the eyes of any other adult on that street. At that moment, to that boy, Richard wasn't a wealthy businessman or an authority figure. He was just someone who looked sad. The innocence and empathy of the question completely disarmed Richard. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The tears he'd been holding back so tightly, the last bastion of his control, finally broke through. They rolled silently down his face, hot and bitter. He hadn't cried like this since he was a boy, since before he learned that men like him didn't cry. But there, on the sidewalk, before a small stranger, he allowed himself to break. The boy wasn't frightened by the tears. He didn't flinch or blush, as an adult might. Instead, he did something that would forever be etched in Richard's memory. He reached into the pocket of his thin jacket and pulled out something. It wasn't a tissue. It was a small packet of crackers, with only one cracker remaining, broken in half. He reached out and offered the piece to Richard, a silent offering. That gesture, so small and yet so monumental, broke something inside Richard on a fundamental level. The pure compassion of that boy, who was offering him literally half of everything he had in the world, was a mirror reflecting the poverty of his own life, despite all his wealth. He, with his millions in the bank, felt like the most miserable of men, and it was a street urchin who offered him sustenance. He looked at the broken cracker in the child's dirty hand and saw the most profound act of generosity he had ever witnessed. "I lost my son," Richard finally managed, his voice cracking, the confession wrenched from his gut. Saying it out loud to that child made it all the more real and devastating. He wasn't asking the boy for help, nor was he expecting him to do anything. He was simply voicing his greatest fear to the only human being who had ever shown him a shred of genuine kindness. The boy listened with that same seriousness in his eyes. He offered no empty words of comfort. Instead, he glanced at the cookie in Richard's hand, which he hadn't yet taken, and then glanced out at the crowd, his small, watchful eyes scanning the scene with an expertise clearly born of a lifetime of observation and survival. He seemed more at home in that chaotic environment than Richard ever had. His calm wasn't passivity, it was a survival skill, the ability to see what others couldn't. The boy then looked back at Richard. "Sometimes," he said, his voice still low but with surprising conviction, "the things we lose are just waiting for us to look the right way." That simple sentence, spoken with a wisdom beyond his years, hit Richard with the force of a punch. He was staring into the abyss, into the worst-case scenario, into tragedy. He was lost in his own panic, looking in the wrong place within his own mind. The boy wasn't just talking about finding Leo. Unbeknownst to him, he was talking about Richard's own life. He had everything, but perhaps he had been looking for meaning in the wrong places all along. In that moment of utter despair, a street urchin was offering him not just a piece of cracker, but the first clue to a path out of the darkness, a path that would begin with the search for his son, but would lead him on a journey far deeper than he could ever imagine. Just then, as Richard stared at the grimy little angel's serious face, his phone rang again, the shrill sound making him jump. He saw Catherine's name on the screen, and his heart sank. He couldn't answer. He couldn't break the news. The boy's hand, Sammy, as he would later discover, was still outstretched. But then the call dropped, and immediately a second call came. It was from Catherine's mother, his mother-in-law. Confused and with a thread of hope so thin it was almost painful, he answered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Hello?" On the other end, his mother-in-law's calm voice rang out, completely oblivious to his torment. "Richard, dear, just letting you know I already picked Leo up from his friend's house. The soccer game ended early. He's here, having dinner and telling me all about your outing on Newbury Street. He's fine." Richard's world stopped spinning. The words took a second to penetrate the thick fog of panic. Leo wasn't lost. Leo was safe. Leo was with his grandmother. A wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked him over, hit him. His legs gave out completely, and he sat down flat on the cold sidewalk, the phone still pressed to his ear, unable to formulate a response. He could only hear his mother-in-law's voice and, in the background, Leo's unmistakable laughter. The most beautiful sound in the world. The tears that had previously been of despair now flowed freely, tears of gratitude, of relief, of a joy so intense it hurt. He murmured a thank you to his mother-in-law and hung up, his entire body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. He was saved. His son was saved. The nightmare was over. But when he looked up, the piece of cookie still untouched in the boy's hand, to finally thank the one who had been his only anchor in the hurricane, it was gone. The dirty little angel, with his wise eyes and his last morsel of food, had vanished back into the crowd as silently as he had appeared, leaving behind only the memory of his gesture and a resounding silence where once there had been panic. The search for Leo was over, but Richard knew with overwhelming certainty that a new search was just beginning. Richard sat on the cold sidewalk for a long moment, the phone dead in his hand. Relief was not a gentle wave of tranquility, but a violent torrent that left him hollow and trembling. Slowly, like an old man, he rose, leaning against the brick wall of a building that, minutes before, had borne witness to his despair. The world around him came back into focus, but the colors seemed different, the sounds sharper. The noise of traffic on Newbury Street, once a cacophony of torture, was now merely the sound of a city continuing to live, oblivious to its recent death and resurrection. He looked at his own hands, the same ones that signed contracts that changed the fate of companies, and saw them as fundamentally incapable at the moment when they mattered most. His suit, once a symbol of his power, was now wrinkled and dirty, a testament to his fall. He felt no shame, only a strange, profound humility. The crisis had passed, but it had left an indelible mark, a chink in his armor of self-sufficiency through which a new light, painful and clear, was beginning to enter. The first thing that cut through the haze of relief was an urgent thought, a need as strong as the one he'd felt to find Leo. He had to find the boy. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, almost a spiritual debt. It was as if that little boy held a missing piece of his soul, a piece Richard hadn't even known he'd lost until that moment. He began scanning the crowd, no longer with the panic of a father searching for his son, but with the focused intensity of a man on a sacred mission. His eyes searched for a faded Red Sox cap, a too thin jacket, a pair of worn sneakers. He moved quickly, circling the area where he'd been, looking behind the streetlights, near the subway entrances, his heart pounding with a new kind of anxiety. He needed to thank them, he needed to understand, he needed to look into those calm eyes once more and somehow return the gesture of the broken biscuit, a gesture that seemed to contain the full weight of human kindness. The urgency was overwhelming. Letting that boy disappear forever would be almost as big a mistake as the one he thought he had made. He approached the same officer he'd approached before. This time his voice was calm, but charged with an intensity that made the weary-faced man pay attention. "There was a boy here just now," Richard said. "A street kid. He talked to me. Have you seen him?" He tried to describe Sammy, but the words seemed inadequate to capture the child's essence. Small, skinny Red Sox cap. He offered me a cracker. The officer shrugged, a gesture of professional indifference tempered with a hint of pity. "Sir, there are a lot of them around here, especially near the common. They come and go. It's hard to keep track." The phrase "hard to keep track" hit Richard with physical force. He imagined Sammy as just another anonymous face, a statistic, a life invisible to the city. The idea filled him with a cold, protective rage. "This one was different," Richard insisted. "His name, I don't even know his name." The realization that he hadn't even asked his little savior's name hit him with a fresh wave of shame. He had been the center of his own universe of pain, and the boy had been merely an anonymous satellite. That mistake, he swore to himself, would be corrected. The drive back to his home on Beacon Hill was a surreal experience. The streets of Boston, which he had always viewed from the air-conditioned comfort of his German sedan as a game board to be conquered, now seemed like a living, breathing, and in many places, suffering organism. For the first time in years, he could actually see the faces of the people at the bus stops, the street vendors, the homeless huddled in sleeping bags outside churches. Before, they had been invisible, part of the urban landscape that his executive brain had learned to filter out as irrelevant data. Now each of them was a universe of untold stories, of silent struggles. His car, a cocoon of leather and metal that represented the pinnacle of his success, suddenly felt like a barrier, an isolation cell separating him from real humanity. He turned off the radio, unable to bear the classical music that normally soothed him. In silence, he replayed the encounter in his mind, the touch of the little hand, the broken biscuit, the phrase, "Sometimes the things we lose are just waiting for us to look on the right side." Entering the impeccable silence of his historic home, with its antique furniture and carefully selected art, the vastness of the space felt oppressive. This was the fortress he had built, a monument to his success and his family lineage, but at that moment, it felt empty of meaning. The relief of knowing Leo was now safe was giving way to a deep unease, a crisis of conscience bubbling beneath the surface. He needed to talk to Catherine, but the upcoming conversation was complex. It wasn't just a misunderstanding about Leo's schedule. It was about his own disintegration, his failure as a father and as a man, and most importantly, the encounter that had rescued him from the depths. He didn't know how to explain that a 5-year-old street kid, in less than 5 minutes, had taught him more about life than a decade at Harvard and 20 years at the top of the corporate world. He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights, feeling like a complete stranger in his own life. He picked up the phone and called Catherine. Her voice, when she answered, was full of everyday normalcy, talking about the traffic and dinner. "Hi, honey. Mom told me you called." "What a mess, huh? I should have told you about the soccer schedule change. I'm sorry." The lightness in her tone contrasted so sharply with the storm he'd just been through that Richard had to sit down. "Catherine," he began, his voice still hoarse. "It wasn't a mess. I thought I'd lost you, really. I panicked." Then he did something he rarely did with anyone, even her. He stripped away all his facade. He told her everything, unfiltered. The blind panic, the desperate rush, the certainty that his life was over. He confessed the paralyzing guilt over the work call, the shame of his negligence. He exposed her fragility in a way she hadn't seen since the beginning of their relationship, when they were just two young people with more dreams than money. He was admitting that the great Richard Sterling, the master of the universe, had completely undone because of a red jacket and an empty space beside him. And then he spoke of the boy. He described the scene in feverish detail, wanting her to feel what he felt. He just appeared, Kat, out of nowhere. His face was dirty, his feet were bare, but his eyes, there was a calmness about him, a dignity I can't describe. He offered me a piece of cracker, the only one he had, and it was like he was giving me the whole world. He told her the boy's words about looking the right way. When the phone rang and I knew Leo was okay, I was on the floor. And when I got up, he was gone. He saved me, Catherine. Not from panic, but from something worse, from myself. And I need to find him. I can't explain it. It's more than a desire. It's a need. I feel I owe him not just a thank you, but a lifetime of debt I need to start paying. The intensity in his voice was unmistakable, the passion of a convert. He wasn't just recounting an event, he was confessing a revelation that had shaken the foundations of his soul. On the other end of the line, Catherine was silent for a long moment, absorbing the story, her husband's vulnerability, the passion in his voice. She knew Richard better than anyone. She knew his iron discipline, his pride, his aversion to any form of weakness or loss of control. Hearing him describe his own disintegration and subsequent epiphany at the hands of a street child was shocking and deeply moving. Her first reaction was immense relief for him, knowing he was no longer carrying that burden alone. Then came understanding. She realized that whatever had happened on that sidewalk was more than a scare. It was a seismic event in her husband's life. It wasn't just about finding a boy to thank. It was about Richard finding a piece of himself he had buried under years of success and ambition. She didn't question his need, didn't rationalize it. She accepted it because she heard in his voice a truth and an urgency that were undeniable and pure. "Okay," Catherine said, her voice soft but firm, an anchor for Richard's emotional storm. "We will find him. Together." The word "we" was all Richard needed to hear. The loneliness of his search instantly dissipated, replaced by the strength of their partnership. It was no longer the obsession of a broken man. It became a shared mission, a new purpose for the couple. They agreed that the next morning they would set aside their schedules, their commitments, and dedicate themselves to a single task: finding the anonymous angel of Newbury Street. That night, Richard barely slept. He lay awake, the image of the boy's face etched in his mind. For the first time, he thought not just about the boy's gesture, but about his life. Where would he sleep on that cold Boston night? Was he hungry? Was he safe? The questions were knives slicing into his newly awakened conscience, each a testament to his former convenient indifference. The search for the boy was no longer about repaying a debt of gratitude, was becoming about righting a cosmic injustice that he had, until then, chosen not to see. The next day, a Sunday, the city was calmer, but Richard and Catherine felt a feverish urgency. They left the comfort of Beacon Hill and returned to the epicenter of the event. But this time, they didn't look at the storefronts. They looked at the edges, the alleys, the faces of the people sitting on the benches of Boston Common. They approached street vendors, car park attendants, the homeless who gathered near Park Street Station. At first, they were met with suspicion. A wealthy, well-dressed couple asked questions about a particular street child. "Why do you want to know about him?" asked a man selling hot dogs, his eyes narrowed. "Is he in trouble?" Richard learned quickly. He guarded his natural authority and spoke with a newfound humility. "No," he replied, his voice sincere. "He helped me when I needed it most. I just want to thank you." The simplicity and honesty of the answer began to break down barriers. They were entering a Boston that existed in the shadows of the city they knew, a world with its own rules, its own language, and its own codes of loyalty. The search stretched on for hours, which turned into days. Monday and Tuesday came and went, with Richard cancelling all his meetings, to the astonishment and confusion of his office. He and Catherine became a constant presence on the streets downtown, in the public garden, near the shelters. They learned to observe, to listen. They brought hot coffee and sandwiches, not as ostentatious charity, but as a gesture of respect, a way to start a conversation, to show they weren't there to judge. They heard dozens of stories of hardship, of survival, of small acts of kindness amidst misery. For Richard, each conversation was a lesson, dispelling his prejudices and ignorance. He was discovering an entire city of resilient and complex people where before he had seen only an anonymous mass of poverty. The search for the boy was becoming an intensive education in the humanity he had spent his entire life avoiding, protected by his wealth and status. They heard snippets of information. "Ah, little Sammy," said an elderly woman knitting on a bench on the common after hearing the description. "Yes, I know him. A quiet boy, very serious for his age." The name Sammy resonated with Richard like music. Finally, their angel had a name. The woman told them that Sammy didn't stay in one place for long, that he was cautious and suspicious of strangers, especially those who seemed to be in authority. "He has his reasons," she said cryptically, before refusing to say more. Richard's frustration was palpable, but Catherine calmed him, teaching him patience, to understand that trust in this world wasn't given for free, but earned with time and respect. They left their phone number with the woman, along with some money, asking her to call if she saw him. Each small step felt monumental, each piece of information a priceless treasure. By Wednesday, discouragement began to set in. They had walked the same streets dozens of times, shown Sammy's mental image to hundreds of people. Richard was beginning to fear he had disappeared forever, a momentary apparition destined to haunt him for the rest of his life, as a reminder of an unpaid debt. He sat on the edge of a fountain in Copley Square, his head in his hands, while Catherine bought bottles of water. He felt foolish, a rich man on a quixotic and perhaps futile quest. Maybe the policeman was right. Maybe Sammy was just one of thousands, and finding him was an impossible task. The discouragement was heavy, almost as overwhelming as the panic he had felt on Newbury Street. But this time, it wasn't about himself. It was about the feeling that he was failing the boy, that the silent promise he had made to himself to repay his kindness would be broken before it even began. It was Catherine who found him, not Sammy, but the next vital clue. She returned with the water bottles and a look of suppressed excitement. "Richard, that street musician," she whispered, discreetly pointing to a young man playing saxophone near the Boston Public Library. "I gave him $20 and asked about Sammy. At first he didn't want to talk, but then I told him the whole story about the cracker, about how you were. I told him we weren't the police, that you just wanted to return the favor." The musician's eyes softened, and he told Catherine that Sammy sometimes hid with others in an old abandoned warehouse near Fort Point Channel, a place the other street children avoided because it was dark and scary. He said Sammy was brave, but that he wasn't alone. "He watches over the other little ones," the musician said. "He's their protector." The phrase echoed the woman's words on the common, adding a new layer of mystery and urgency to the search. Hearts pounding, they followed the musician's instructions. The streets became more industrial, the buildings more decrepit. They found the place, a massive red brick warehouse with broken windows like empty eyes and a large sliding metal door, ajar, inviting darkness. The air around the building was heavy, smelling of mildew, salt air, and abandonment. For a moment, they hesitated at the entrance, a couple visibly out of place on the border between their safe world and unknown, potentially dangerous territory. Richard looked at Catherine, a silent question in his eyes. She simply nodded, the determination on her face mirroring his. They hadn't come this far to back down now. Together they pushed open the heavy door, which creaked in protest, and stepped into the shadows, the sound of the city fading behind them, replaced by a deep, expectant silence. The warehouse's interior was cavernous and gloomy. The scant light that filtered through the dirty, broken windows overhead created long streaks of dancing dust in the chilly air. The floor was covered in debris, broken pallets, and rusted old equipment. Every step they took echoed in the silence, a loud, intrusive sound that made them feel like trespassers. "Sammy!" Richard called, his voice sounding strangely small in the vast space. There was no answer, only the echo of his own voice. They advanced cautiously, their eyes trying to adjust to the darkness. They saw evidence of life, a small, torn mattress in a corner, a few empty food cans, a threadbare blanket folded neatly over a wooden crate. The poverty was overwhelming, but there was also a strange sense of order, of an effort to create a home amidst the ruin. The sight struck Richard more deeply than any poverty statistic he had ever read in a report. They moved deeper into the warehouse, moving toward an area where a stack of boxes and tarps formed a sort of makeshift wall, a fort within a fortress. "Sammy, we're not going to hurt you," Catherine said softly, her calm maternal voice designed to soothe, not frighten. "We just want to talk. The saxophonist sent us here." The silence that followed was so thick that Richard could hear his own heart pounding. He braced himself for disappointment, for the discovery that the place was empty, that they had arrived too late. He wondered if all that searching had been in vain, if he was destined to carry this debt forever. The image of Sammy's face, however, remained vivid in his mind, urging him forward. He felt he was close, that the answer to the restlessness that had consumed him since Saturday lay somewhere in that cold, damp darkness. And then a small sound broke the silence, the scrape of a foot on concrete. On the other side of the rubble wall, a small shadow moved. Richard and Catherine stopped, holding their breath. Slowly, a head with light brown hair and a faded Red Sox cap appeared around the edge. It was the same eyes. Calm, serious, but now with a layer of suspicion and a fierce, protective instinct. Sammy emerged from the shadows, not like a frightened victim, but like a guardian of his domain. He was clutching a piece of bread in one hand, and his body was tense, ready to flee or fight. He looked at Richard, and a flash of recognition passed across his face, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened wariness. He wasn't on Newbury Street now. This was his territory, and the power dynamics had subtly shifted. Richard stepped forward, his hands raised in a universal gesture of peace, showing he had nothing in them. "Sammy," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "We found you." He wanted to say more, wanted to pour out all his gratitude and the questions plaguing him, but the words stuck in his throat. Just looking at the boy, real and tangible there in front of him, was overwhelming. Sammy didn't respond. He just watched, his eyes moving from Richard to Catherine, assessing the threat, assessing the intent. The silence stretched, a tense moment of nonverbal communication where a lifetime of distrust battled a glimpse of something different. Richard felt himself being tested, his sincerity being weighed on the scales of Sammy's street experience, a scale that rarely tipped in favor of trust in adults. And it was in that moment of tense silence that the true nature of the situation revealed itself in all its tragic glory. From behind Sammy's legs, an even smaller figure appeared. A girl, perhaps 4 years old, with wide, frightened eyes, who clung tightly to Sammy's jacket as if he were a tree in a storm. Then 2 other small heads peered over the mound of rubble. 2 boys, even younger, whose faces were a mixture of curiosity and fear. Sammy wasn't just protecting himself. Richard and Catherine froze, realization hitting them with the force of a wave. The musician was right. The woman in the park was right. Sammy wasn't just a lonely street urchin. He was the older brother, the father, the guardian of a small, fragile flock of abandoned children. The search for one boy had ended, but now they found themselves facing 4. The scale of their responsibility, the depth of the tragedy and courage contained in that dark warehouse opened before them, vast and terrifying, and somehow undeniably theirs to face. Richard and Catherine stood motionless, the sound of their own hearts echoing in the dusty silence of the warehouse. The sight of 4 childlike faces, frightened and dirty, yet united by a fierce, silent loyalty, was more overwhelming than any market crisis or hostile negotiation they had ever faced. The mission to thank a boy had become a monumental responsibility, one they hadn't asked for, but now seemed impossible to ignore. It was no longer about a gesture of gratitude. It was about the fate of 4 human beings. Richard felt the weight of that reality crash down on him with crushing force. All his life, he had dealt with problems that could be quantified, analyzed in spreadsheets, and solved with logic and capital. But here, before this small, makeshift family, he felt completely bereft of his usual tools. What could he offer that truly mattered? The panic he had felt on Newbury Street was selfish and singular. What he felt now was vast and selfless, a fear not for himself, but for the fragile souls that stared at him from the shadows with wary eyes. It was Catherine who broke the spell. With a grace and intuition Richard had always admired but never fully understood, she moved slowly and sat on an old wooden crate a few feet away, making herself smaller, less imposing. She didn't look directly at Sammy, the guardian, but at the little girl hiding behind him, her torn skirt barely covering her scraped knees. "Hello," Catherine said, her voice so soft it was almost part of the silence. "My name is Catherine, and this is my husband, Richard." She opened her bag and took out a bottle of water and a granola bar, placing them on the floor halfway between them. "You must be hungry." The gesture was disarmingly simple, devoid of any demands or expectations. It wasn't a forced rescue, it was a humble offering. In that moment, Richard understood that true power was not in the strength or authority he wielded in his world, but in radical kindness, in the ability to connect with another's vulnerability without exploiting it. Sammy watched every movement with the intensity of a wild animal protecting its young. His eyes flickered from Catherine to the food on the floor, then to Richard, who remained motionless, understanding that his role in that moment was to be a silent, non-threatening presence. The man accustomed to leading, giving orders, and controlling every room he entered was now in the background, a mere spectator in the most important negotiation of his life. And the primary negotiator was his wife, whose only tactic was compassion and patience. Sammy didn't relax, but neither did he stop them. He was at an impasse, the instinct to protect his children, forged in months of danger and abandonment, fighting against the possibility, however small, that this offer was genuine. To him, kindness from strangers was a dangerous anomaly, often the prelude to something terrible, bait for a trap. Trust was a currency he didn't possess and couldn't afford to accept easily from anyone. The little girl broke the impasse. After a long moment that felt like an hour, she released Sammy's jacket and took a hesitant step toward the granola bar. Sammy made a subtle movement with her arm, as if to stop her, but stopped, her hand hovering in the air. The girl, whom they would later discover was named Maya, took the bar with both hands and, instead of eating it, turned and offered it to Sammy. That small act of loyalty, that instinctive trust in the leader of their little group, seemed to ease the tension in the air. Sammy looked at the bar, then at Maya, and finally at Catherine. He took the bar, broke it into 4 uneven pieces, giving the largest to Maya and the others to the 2 heads still peering out from the shadows. It was a ceasefire, a small, fragile moment of respite. For Richard, that scene, sharing a granola bar in an abandoned warehouse, was more moving and meaningful than the celebration of any billion-dollar acquisition. It was a deal, sealed not with ink, but with a gesture of sharing and a glimmer of trust. They spent the next few hours in that warehouse, which gradually transformed from a creepy den into a sanctuary. Catherine and Richard sat on the dirt floor, sharing the food they had bought at a nearby convenience store. They didn't ask many questions. They simply created a safe space for the children to exist, talking quietly about trivial things, about the weather, about Boston baseball teams. Slowly, the stories came in fragments, not in direct answers, but in snatches of conversation between the children themselves. They learned the names of the other 2 boys, Ben and Eli, the youngest. They discovered that Sammy had found them one by one, abandoned or fleeing from terrible situations their childish minds could barely articulate. He brought them together, taught them how to survive, how to hide, how to find food in the city's remains. He was the leader, the strategist, the caretaker. Listening to the saga of this 5-year-old child who carried the weight of 3 other lives on her tiny shoulders was both inspiring and deeply painful, a silent indictment of a world that allowed such things to happen. Richard exchanged a look with Catherine over the children's heads. No words were needed. The same conclusion had formed in both their hearts, as clear and undeniable as the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the ceiling, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. They couldn't leave. They couldn't leave those children there, returning to their immaculate home on Beacon Hill, to their comfortable lives, knowing they would continue in that cold darkness, would be an act of cruelty that would stain their souls forever. The memory of the panic he felt at the thought of losing his only son for 30 minutes was a bad joke compared to Sammy's daily reality. This encounter wasn't a quirk of fate. It was a summons, a turning point that demanded a fitting response. The universe hadn't brought them here to simply feed them and leave. It had brought them here to change, to act, to become the people they, deep down, were always meant to be. Heart in his throat, Richard turned to Sammy. He chose his words with the utmost care, with the delicacy of someone trying not to scare a wounded bird. "Sammy," he began, his voice low and calm, devoid of any command. "We have a home. It's warm, with soft beds and plenty of food. No one will ever be hungry or cold again." He paused, letting the words settle in the heavy air of the warehouse. "We'd like you to come with us. All of you, just for tonight, so you can sleep safely and take a hot shower. Tomorrow we'll see what we do. No obligation, just a safe place for one night." He presented the offer as something temporary, a small token of security, knowing that a proposal of permanent change would be too frightening. He was asking a leap of faith from a child whom life had brutally taught never to trust anyone, least of all adults with easy promises. Sammy was silent, processing the offer. His serious eyes seemed to age even more, bearing the weight of a decision no adult should have to make, much less a child. Richard could see the struggle in his face. On one side, the promise of warmth, food and safety, basic desires that were, for him, unattainable luxuries. On the other, the fear of the unknown, the instinctive distrust of adults and their promises that always proved empty or dangerous. He was the protector. If he made the wrong decision, the consequences would fall not only on him, but on the three souls who depended on him for everything. He looked at Maya, who was already dozing, leaning against Catherine. He looked at Ben and Eli, whose eyes were fixed on Richard, a mixture of hope and fear. The responsibility for those three lives weighed heavily on him. He wasn't just a child deciding whether to accept an invitation. He was a leader deciding the fate of his people, of his small, fragile nation born of abandonment. What finally sealed the deal was a sound. The youngest, Eli, let out a dry, deep cough, a sound that spoke of cold, damp, and a fragile health that wouldn't last much longer under these conditions. Sammy's eyes fixed on Eli, and the hesitation on his face gave way to a grim resolve. Their well-being was more important than his fear. He turned to Richard, his small chin lifted in a gesture of dignity and surrender. He didn't say yes. He simply gave a single solemn nod. In that nod, Richard felt the transfer of a sacred burden. Sammy was handing over custody of his family, the most precious thing he had in the world. A wave of emotion, gratitude, humility, terror, and fierce joy swept through Richard, and he had to fight back tears. He nodded back to the boy, sealing the pact. The most significant agreement of his life, made without lawyers, without contracts, with only the trust of a child. Leaving the warehouse was like emerging from a grave into a new world. Richard carried little Eli, who had fallen asleep on his shoulder, his feverish body against his chest. Catherine held Maya's hand, and Sammy, after a moment's hesitation, allowed Ben to hold her other hand, while he reluctantly extended his own to Richard, his small, calloused fingers barely encircling Richard's. The feel of that little hand in his was the final confirmation of his transformation. As they walked toward the car, the four children blinked in the late afternoon light, their frail figures a stark contrast to the harshness of the industrial landscape. To passers-by, they were a strange and inexplicable sight. To Richard, it seemed the most natural and right thing in the world. He wasn't rescuing four children. He felt that the four children, led by a 5-year-old boy, were rescuing him from the empty, selfish life he had led. He was being led out of the darkness. The first night was a collage of surreal and moving moments, the children's silent wonder as hot water magically appeared from a faucet. The way they ate, slowly and deliberately, as if unsure whether the food would disappear or be taken from them. Richard watched them, his heart sinking as they rejected the separate guest rooms with their soft beds and clean sheets, opting instead to cuddle together on a large comforter Catherine had placed on the living room floor, recreating the only security they had ever known: closeness. Richard and Catherine stayed up late, simply watching them sleep, their soft breaths filling the silence of their immaculate home. The space, once cold and minimalist, was suddenly filled with a life and purpose that no piece of art or designer furniture could ever provide. They were parents of 5 now. The idea was both terrifying and utterly wonderful. The following days were a blur of chaotic activity and profound learning. They took the children to the doctor, bought new clothes, dealt with nightmarish nightmares and the traumatized silence that sometimes settled like a cloud. Richard, the man of schedules and efficiency, the master of corporate strategy, discovered that trauma doesn't follow a schedule and can't be optimized. He learned patience, to celebrate small victories that would previously have gone unnoticed. Maya's first smile, Ben's first complete sentence, the day Sammy called him by his name instead of sir. He and Catherine functioned as a team, dividing the tasks, supporting each other when exhaustion and the magnitude of the task seemed overwhelming. Their home, once a sanctuary of order and silence, became a noisy, messy playground, and Richard had never felt so at home in his life. He was discovering a capacity for love that was far more vast than he had ever imagined. Introducing the children to Leo was a delicate moment, one that Richard and Catherine planned carefully. They explained to Leo that Sammy, Maya, Ben, and Eli were children who didn't have a home or parents to care for them. and that they would now be part of his family. Leo, with the simple and straightforward logic of childhood, regarded the four newcomers with cautious curiosity. There were initial moments of jealousy at having to share attention and toys, as was to be expected. But soon, the loneliness of being an only child was replaced by the chaotic joy of brotherhood. He taught Sammy how to use a video game, and Sammy, in turn, taught him how to identify different types of birds through the window. Seeing them playing together on the living room rug, 5 children from different worlds forming the bonds of a new and unlikely tribe, was proof to Richard that he was on the right path, however difficult it might be. The inevitable complication arrived about a month later, like a shadow from the past. Word that a wealthy couple had taken in 4 street children spread through the city's informal channels. One afternoon, a woman appeared at the building's lobby, claiming to be Sammy's biological mother. The old Richard would have responded with an army of lawyers, restraining orders, and intimidation. He would have seen the woman as a threat to be neutralized at any cost. But the new Richard, the man who had been broken and rebuilt by the compassion of a child, acted differently. He went down to meet her, not with anger, but with profound sadness. He saw before him not a villain, but a woman broken by life, her eyes haunted by addiction and despair, a victim of circumstances he could barely fathom. She wanted money, yes, but beneath the demands, Richard saw the shame and pain of a mother who had failed. Richard invited her to coffee at a nearby bakery, away from prying eyes. Catherine stayed with the children, trusting him to handle the situation. He listened to her story, a sad, circular narrative of poor choices, poverty, and lack of opportunity. He didn't judge her. He saw in her a dark reflection of what life could be like without the safety net he'd always taken for granted. He was firm about one thing: the safety and well-being of Sammy and the other children were his absolute priority and non-negotiable. But he also offered help. He offered to pay for a rehabilitation program, to help her find a job once she was clean, to ensure she had a chance to rebuild her life. He wasn't offering her a payment to disappear, but a chance at redemption. She wept, surprised by the compassion where she'd expected hostility. That day, Richard not only protected his new family, but also honored Sammy's gesture, reaching out to someone the world had discarded. After navigating the complex legal and emotional web, with the birth mother finally accepting help and relinquishing her parental rights in exchange for a second chance at life, the path to adoption became clear. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a choice forged in the fire of daily experience, in the joy of smiles and the challenges of nighttime crying jags. The moment of final decision didn't happen in a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It happened on a lazy Sunday on Boston Common. Richard watched the scene, Catherine pushing Maya on the swing, Leo and Ben competing in an impromptu race to the duck statue, and Sammy with little Eli on his shoulders laughing, a genuine, carefree laugh Richard had never heard before. In that sound, in that image of simple, achieved happiness, Richard felt a sense of peace and purpose so profound that it filled all the empty spaces he used to fill with work and success. This was his life now. This was his true wealth, his legacy. A year later, life in Richard and Catherine's house was a beautifully orchestrated chaos. The walls, once bare and white, were now covered with colorful drawings, family photos, and a height chart that marked the growth of 5 children. The silence had been permanently replaced by a soundtrack of laughter, discussions about toys, the sound of little feet running down the hallway, and the incessant questions of curious minds. Lucas had become a proud and sometimes bossy older brother. Maya, once silent and scared, was now a talkative and affectionate girl who loved to dance. Ben and Eli, healthy and energetic, were each other's shadows, and Sammy, though still with a thoughtful seriousness in his eyes, had rediscovered the lightness of childhood. He was a voracious reader, devouring books every night beside Catherine, his face no longer tense with the worry of survival, but lit up with the magic of stories. It wasn't a perfect family, but it was a real one, united not just by blood, but by a conscious daily choice to love and care for one another. Richard stood in his office, a space very different from what it had once been. He had sold a majority stake in his investment firm, divesting himself of his most aggressive assets, and used the proceeds to create a foundation dedicated to helping homeless children and families in crisis in Boston. His work was no longer about maximizing profits, but about maximizing human impact. He was no longer interested in conquering markets, but in changing lives. On his desk, where business awards and stock charts had once sat, now sat a single photograph in a silver frame, a candid shot taken on a beach in Cape Cod, with Catherine and the 5 children in a laughing heap covered in sand. He looked at that photo and saw the map to his own salvation. He had spent his entire life building an empire, only to discover that the only kingdom that mattered was the one that fit within the confines of his home and his heart. He finally understood, on a cellular level, Sammy's prophetic words that day on Newbury Street. Sometimes the things we lose are just waiting for us to look the right way. He had searched for happiness in financial statements, for validation in corporate acquisitions, and for a sense of identity in his social status. He was looking at skyscrapers when the treasure lay on the ground, in the eyes of a street kid. His greatest fear, losing his son, led him to find his true calling. The loss of control led him to find true purpose. He realized that compassion was not a weakness, as his corporate world had taught him, but the greatest human strength, the only one capable of building something that time cannot destroy. His greatest and most profitable merger was not between 2 companies, but between 2 families, between 2 worlds that should never have met. On an autumn afternoon, 2 years after the day that changed everything, Richard walked down the same sidewalk on Newbury Street, but this time he wasn't alone. He held 2 small hands, Leo on one side, Sammy on the other. Behind them, Catherine walked with the other 3 children. For a moment, they stood at the exact spot where Richard had collapsed. He looked at the spot, not with the trauma of panic, but with a strange, profound gratitude. It was there, on that patch of concrete, that his empty life had been demolished so that a new, noisy, and infinitely richer one could be built. He felt a tug on his hand and looked down. Sammy was looking at him and then back at the spot. No words were spoken, but in their eyes was a shared recognition, the memory of a broken cookie and an encounter that altered the course of their destinies. Richard knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level, and hugged him. The panic of that day had transformed into purpose. Loss had given way to an abundance he had never dreamed of. His life had not been ruined that afternoon. On the contrary, it was there, at the lowest point of his despair, that he was, for the first time, truly saved. Sammy didn't seek recompense. He simply saw a broken man and offered him half of everything he had in the world. And by extending his hand with a broken cracker, he not only anchored a father in his worst nightmare, he wove a safety net for 3 other lost souls, and showed a tycoon the power of a gesture that no amount of money can buy. Often, the race for success isolates us in ivory towers with schedules so packed there's no room for humanity. But Richard and Sammy's journey teaches us that the most valuable connection happens not in a boardroom, but on a sidewalk when hearts open to one another. They remind us that the safest investment isn't in the stock market, but in the compassion we offer, and that the true measure of a man isn't how high he can climb, but how low he's willing to stoop to help someone else rise. If this story of empathy and redemption touched your heart as it transformed the lives of Richard, Sammy, and their new and extraordinary family, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that remind us of what really matters, seeing beyond appearances and listening with the soul.